Welcome back. Chuck DeVore is in the house virtually. We're talking with him about the condition of our military and some very interesting research that he has done on this whole thesis that the military is awash with white supremacists and needs to be re-educated or purged of them. And Chuck, you were developing several points that belied those assertions by, I think, not just NPR and other media outlets after the January 6th events, but Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense himself, and his personnel. So finish that
Right.
thought if you would.
Yeah. So just to summarize, based on false information, the Secretary of Defense did this big stand down against white supremacy and right wing extremism, predicated on bad math coming out of the January 6th riot arrest. So I mentioned before the issue with the age range that the CNN and NPR got wrong. I mentioned the issue of gender or sex, right? So men are some 15 or 18 times more likely to be veterans than are women. And men constituted about 88% of those arrested at the riots. And then the last factor that contributed, again, to about a 20% overestimation was that the media is all too happy to mention when someone was, for example, a veteran of the National Guard or the Reserve and was arrested at the riots. Now, what's interesting, Frank, is until very recently, the U.S. Census Bureau did not consider individuals who were in the reserves or the National Guard to be veterans unless they had been federalized, unless they had been called up to active duty or gone to war. Now, I've been federalized a couple of times as a National Guard officer, once during the LA riots in 1992 and once during the Gulf War in 91, 92. So I would be considered a veteran by the Census Bureau's standards.
Mhm.
But many, many millions of people who served in the Guard and Reserve don't meet the standard. And so that also then contributed to a significant percentage error in terms of the share of veterans arrested after those riots. And so at the end of the day, the share of veterans arrested were exactly what you would expect from any random sample of Americans of that sex that were being arrested. And so
Interesting.
instead of double, it was exactly what you would expect. I think slightly less
Yeah.
once the additional arrests were made. So that was, to me, just a travesty that the Secretary of
Right.
Defense would take action on such wrong math.
A political agenda, I think, is the best way to describe it, and as you say, a travesty indeed. Hey, Chuck, before we run out of time, let me take advantage of your being with us to ask you about Ukraine. As we're speaking, of course, the G7 is meeting. They're talking about their commitment to Ukraine. There's an EU meeting coming up, a NATO summit coming up, in which this will be one of the very top topics, of course. Um, Talk a little bit about where we are at the moment in Ukraine. Russian uh, forces are, it seems, moving with considerable effect in the Donbass eastern part of the region of the country, but now also once again resuming long range fire at targets farther to the west, including Kiev. Uh, what's your sort of sit rep, if you would, situation
Right.
report on Ukraine?
So the Ukraine defense minister recently announced they're going to a mobile defense, and so I think that's just an acknowledgement of the fact that they can't do these set piece battles in areas where they have not had extensive preparation of fortifications. And so, as the Russians have gradually pushed out the Ukrainians from these regions in the Donbass that have been contested for some 8 years, they've gradually either outflanked or overrun the extensive fortifications that the Ukrainians have prepared over an 8 year period of time. And as a result, the Ukrainians, largely a foot soldier military, have become increasingly vulnerable to artillery, which is the main killer on the modern battlefield. You're going to see about 80% of your casualties will be generated by artillery. And of course, that's what the
Wow.
Russians really specialize in. And so this is entirely expected. The Russians and the Ukrainians continue to take very, very heavy casualties. And I think it's very important from an American standpoint. You mentioned in our discussion prior to our appearing together your concern about war stocks and about replenishing those. I think it's extremely important that we really focus on this, especially because of the worldwide chip shortage, number one.
Yes.
Number two, because of the growing threat from China as it poses to Taiwan. And fortunately, in one respect, any sort of conflict we might have with China over the Taiwan Strait is going to have very different sorts of equipment and consumables being used than the sorts of things that we're sending to Ukraine. There is some overlap, though. And I'm just very concerned that this current administration and Congress isn't taking this seriously. And lastly, Frank, I think you see that in President Biden's continued drawdown of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's being used
Yes.
for political purposes, trying to rescue his abysmal approval ratings. And as a result, it hasn't been this low, I think, since about 1987 or 86.
Yeah.
This is unacceptable. If something
I
major
couldn't
happens,
agree with you
we're
more.
running out of oil.
I'm so glad that you've mentioned that, Chuck, because this is one of those topics on which I think not nearly enough attention is being applied. Um, One of the things that I have come to believe about the Biden presidency is it is a wrecking operation across the board. And what it is doing in case after case, policy after policy, domestic, foreign, both, is leaving us much less capable, much less prepared to deal with some very problematic contingencies. And you've mentioned a couple of them. War with Russia would be one, of course. War with China would be another. And what we're doing with the drawing down inexorable, what is it, 1 million barrels a day of those strategic petroleum reserves is putting us in a position where we will be much more vulnerable should any of those scenarios eventuate. This is irresponsible in the extreme, it seems to me, and going to get, well, not just people killed, almost certainly, but our economy devastated as well. Chuck, we are out of time. I appreciate so much what you are doing these days at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And thank you, as always, for your service to our country in uniform and in the state legislature of California as well. You are a man we admire greatly and value your contributions to this program. Look forward to the next one in the near
Thank you,
future, I
Frank.
hope. Look forward to talking to the rest of you again tomorrow, same time, same station. I hope you found this edition of Securing America to be have helped you in joining us in protecting the country we love. For more information about doing so, go to securingamerica.tv and then go forth and multiply.